So just in case you were wondering, the golden rule is still true. So we think about this in terms of isolating back-end versus front-end. We showed you how to do that with navigation timing. This is a great graphic that was taken back from Steve's book when he first published it. It really shows that all the time is being spent on the front end, 80% of the time, 90% from what we see. When we look at this in RUM, this is how it actually manifests and shows itself. So absolutely, we still see that same story, whether you're looking at synthetic or RUM. And very important to kind of isolate where this time is being spent when you look across all your different pages and all your different users. And I'm kind of going on here, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Well, talking a little bit about DOM events. So I think one of the things we kind of sell nav timing short on is all this great stuff that's in there. And we tend to sometimes look at it and go, okay, well, that's kind of interesting, but not super interesting, so I'm going to forget about it for a while. I think that there's some good stuff that we need to sort of bubble back up. I think we'll talk a little bit about advancements in timing and looking at user timing and more advanced techniques, but let's not forget about what's already there. One of those things that I think gets sold short a lot of the time is the tracking of all these different DOM events, like DOM loading time, DOM interactive, DOM content loaded, the actual load time for the DOM content, DOM complete, and page load. So examples of how you would pull that from the interface. And why this is important, I think, is what's shown here. I pulled this out and I started looking at this data and was like, wow, it's really kind of, I wonder how complex the DOM on the top is compared to the bottom. And what I'm seeing is the fact that this yellow line, DOM loading, is so far from the DOM interactive on the site that's got 2,618 DOM nodes versus the one on the bottom, which only has 86 DOM nodes. So using that as a way to kind of think about DOM complexity as a web developer, what can we be doing to simplify the DOM? Do we really need all these scripts? Do we really need all these different nodes and child nodes? Or can we clean that up a bit and potentially improve the performance of our site? So I think that this is a great way to visualize that using those metrics that we pulled out before. All right. Measuring object level performance. So now we're going to transition a little bit into something I think more advanced and interesting, and that's really measuring the resources on our page, the actual assets on our page. So what is it that someone from marketing might need to understand? What is it that other developers and people in the organization might need to understand about individual assets? Well, as we have illustrated a couple of times, third-party complexity is a problem. So how does third-party complexity affect my performance? How long does it take a group of assets to download if you're looking at CDN A versus B or your different sharded image domains? How are assets being served by a CDN exactly? And how are those performing against each other? So what we use is an API called resource timing to answer that. Resource timing interface was another thing that came out of the performance working group, the Jedi Council, that focused on object level performance. So resource timing is great because we can actually see the performance of the individual asset. With one caveat, which I'll get to in a second, we can actually see these different component level breakdowns of timing for the individual resource. So redirect, app cache, DNS, TCP, request and response time, not for the entire page like we see with navigation timing, but for the individual asset. So very powerful when you're measuring this from all your different end users. Support for this, unfortunately, not in Safari, but it is in all of our other major browsers, and hopefully we're getting there with Safari on that as well. The caveat that I mentioned for a second there was that you have to have this timing allow origin HTTP response header defined for the domain that you're serving the asset from in order to see the component level breakdown. Otherwise, what you see is just the duration for this resource, which is still great and still really good information, but it's not going to be quite as specific and quite as componentized, if you will, as if you had the cross-origin resource defined. Okay, moving along through that, here's how you would go about actually querying the performance timeline to get a lot of these different times using an image that I was serving there. We can get the load time, the DNS time, the TCP, time spent waiting, and we can get the fetch time as well. So that's how you go out measuring a single resource. But other uses for resource timing I think are even more interesting. Identifying the slowest resource in a page. Looking at time to first image download, really not necessarily render time, but time to first image. Response time by domain, a group of assets, response time by initiator type, JavaScript, CSS, whatever it might be. looking at cache hit ratios for different resources. And this is interesting because the resource timing API doesn't give you that back automatically, but you can derive it by saying, okay, well, we know that this resource that took 1 millisecond to load or 5 milliseconds to load was served from cache and was not served over the network. So you can start to identify cache hit for that specific resource. There's a lot of great resources. And again, standing on the shoulders of people better than I have contributed to this repository where you can go in and look at a lot of these for yourself. This being one of those examples. I thought this was a great way to illustrate the performance of two different sharded image domains being served from a CDN and the impact that had on page load time. So we've got image A and B, and really there's no need for showing both, I just did. But you see this big drop here in performance, and you can see that there's really no associated drop or degradation in performance for the image assets. So we can isolate and say, well, this is not an issue with my CDN. This is not a problem with the assets that were actually being served from my CDN. However, down the line where we see the second arrow, we do see that that improvement. Sorry, not a degradation, an improvement in page load time. We see that it does correlate with that time from the CDN. So a great way to kind of isolate root cause around page load time and really identify the assets that are impacting that in the long haul. Questions about resource timing? Yeah.
So the data for resource timing, can that be sent back through like Boomerang or some other resource?
Yeah, it actually can. And one thing, it is a lot of data, and I think there's been a lot of sort of painstaking effort gone into like compressing that data and fitting it into a post request that was performant and everything else. I think we've contributed that back into Boomerang, correct? Yeah. So it's actually available in Boomerang, and it'll allow you to send back that entire resource tree that's heavily compressed so you can get that data. So it is possible. You have to think about it. And a lot of times what you can do, if you don't want to get the entire waterfall for a page, and you want options, you can do a lot of that client-side aggregation using a lot of those JavaScript examples that we were referencing in that GitHub repo, where you can do the aggregation and say, just send me the timing for the slowest asset, or just send me the average response time for a group of assets, and it's one metric compared to 150 or whatever it might be. Yeah? Do you say what browsers provide resource timing? Yeah, so these are the browsers that support it, the mainstream browsers. Also supported an Android browser, so I don't have that shown here, but I think this covers it. It's a great site, caniuse.com, where you can query and see, can I use resource timing, and it'll show you all the browser support. Can I use navigation timing, it'll show you the browser support. So great link to check out, because hopefully we see that changing more and more as we progress. Okay, moving along into measuring the user experience. So as a designer, I really want to understand when users perceive the page to be ready, right? So something that's maybe more of a subjective measurement. How long until my page begins to actually render? When is the above the fold content visible, right? When can I actually see assets that were served above the fold? So we look at different metrics for that, like start render and leveraging user timing. I'll get to user timing in 1 second. We can also look at things, and one of the things that we first thought when we saw first paint show up in the performance timeline was, oh wow, we finally got a great render metric. But it's kind of a fallacy, unfortunately. We saw it, we thought it was great, and then we started comparing it and seeing that it's actually not, for one thing, it's not really standardized between the browsers. They're both kind of reporting different events, and it's a different code path for each browser. But the other thing is it's not really telling us about render. What it might tell us is, hey, this big blank white page was painted onto the browser, which really isn't telling us so much about start render. What I'm comparing there, those 2 points, one is the MS First Paint, and the other is start render that's actually taken from web page test and synthetic, which we know to be true. We can see a 1 second first paint time equated to a blank white page versus a true start render, which is around 2 seconds. So look out for that as you're looking at these render metrics and understanding when the page becomes visible. And this is, again, another sort of shout out to synthetic and the fact that we can use these film strips as a way to say, hey, how fast does that page actually begin to paint to the browser, and how's that user experience actually impacted? So a great tool for measuring user experience. However, the user timing interface, the third thing that I'll mention today that was given to us by that performance working group, allows us to actually go through and set performance marks that we know about. So you're an application developer, you know your code, you know what it is you want to measure. So now we've got this great interface where we can set high precision timestamps within our code when something's ready and measure that. And it really is as simple as putting performance mark, and then for performance measuring the duration between two marks. So a great tool, great thing that we're starting to see supported in commercial tools as well, which is nice because now you can kind of compare numbers from web page tests with some of your RUM data in a really great way to measure the actual user experience. Here's some code for that, show you how you can actually work with that interface. Like I said, it really is as easy as setting performance.mark and then naming that mark. And then if you want to measure duration, naming the duration, and then the two marks that you actually want to measure between. Yeah, question? It can be whatever. Really, it exists. It's just you actually place it in JavaScript in your code. So, one example that I was going to get to here is hey, I want to measure the time for an image to load. I want to actually put the performance mark in the onload handler for the image. You can do that. You could do something like, on a callback from an asynchronous script that you have on the page, call that performance mark and set that there. It's really wherever you want to place it. And that's what's so powerful about it, because you really can start to define your own version of done, your own version of ready, or above the fold, or whatever it might be. So that's the code you would use to actually place that in the image handler. So if you wanted to measure that hero image or something in terms of that. But keep in mind, this is measuring download time. This isn't necessarily measuring render time. There's a great post here that Steve wrote on hero image delay. We're seeing a lot of hero images being used, and I think they're beautiful and they're great, but they're so prominent on the page. A lot of people really want to understand how fast does that hero image begin to render. So there's some great techniques for measuring not just the download time, but also the perceived render time for those things, and you can leverage those there. Okay, another great example here. Pat wrote this all the way back in 2013, so I mean, it's pretty awesome because we're just talking about user timing now, and he's actually been talking about it for a couple of years.
He's a pioneer.
Yeah, exactly. So he had a great method of measuring an above the fold time for web page test, just to kind of show some of the differences with onload versus what you might measure for above the fold. Questions on user timing? Comments on user timing? Yeah. I'm sorry. I really can't.
Maybe come closer.
Can you come? Yeah.
How do you measure? What do you do with it?
If it's not supported?
iPhone doesn't.
Well, I think what the question was, if it's not supported, how do you go about measuring those things? And one of the things that's awesome about user timing is it's pretty easy to polyfill, to actually write code to support that for unsupported browsers. In this blog post, Pat actually has a link to the polyfill that he wrote to do that for browsers like Safari and others that don't support user timing. So that's how you would, that's my answer, is go to Pat's blog and and you've got a great answer there for it. But yeah, it's not super complicated, so it's actually something that can be pretty easily polyfilled versus something like resource timing or that we can't get access to right now. Okay. Measuring the performance of single page applications. This is one that's kind of becoming more of a hot button, and I'm going to end up pointing you to a blog post again, so spoiler alert. But the problem with single page applications and this big move to these frameworks like Angular and Ember and others when it comes to measuring performance is that we start to lose context for how we actually, how are we doing? How we actually have thought about measuring performance in the past, where we might have been dependent on an onload event. So what this waterfall is showing you is a hard navigation for an AngularJS app, and we can see that onload event fires there, and then all these visible assets are actually downloaded after the onload event. So the onload event is really kind of worthless when we're looking at these single page applications. So it's created a challenge for us, and something that we've been focusing on a bit at SOSTA, and the Boomerang team's been focusing quite a bit on. The things I wanted to call out about measuring SPAs was that we really just need to accept the fact that onload really no longer matters when we're looking at this. You can tie into the different routing events for the SPA frameworks, but keep in mind that's not necessarily going to give you the download time for the resources that existed within that hard or soft navigation. And you can look at measuring downloads during those soft refreshes. We've done some work here. There's quite a bit more documentation that's gone into this a little bit more. We're looking at Angular, we're looking at Backbone, we're looking at Ember and ways to more commonly support that. But it's a challenge, And the reason I'm bringing it up is the fact that we have to start thinking about this. We got to start standardizing on this, to your point earlier. And how do we go about actually doing that is kind of an interesting road. But we've done some great work there. It's actually supported now in Boomerang, where we can actually time those hard and soft navigations. But it's a different challenge we all have to start facing now. Anybody working on SPAs? Yeah, quite a few. Okay. All right. So I'm going to breathe.
Are you all right?
I'm good. I'm good.
I feel bad you had to do so much talking.
Oh, that's all right.
I'll give you a little break for a little bit.
That's right.
Okay, so how fast should I be? This is a question we get asked a lot, and it's kind of like, just like there's no kind of one perfect metric, there's no one perfect, oh, you should be 2 seconds. I mean, users say they want pages to load in 2 seconds, but really the number varies from site to site, from user to user, from use case to use case. So just talking a little bit about measuring the business impact, because ultimately for a lot of people, I'm going to assume most of the people in this room, if you manage to convince your company to send you here, is that there's some understanding that performance has some kind of business impact. So finding that meaningful business metric that works for your site and your business. So if you're reporting to somebody who cares about business impact or performance, generally they just want to know how performance affects whatever KPIs they care about, and often how your site compares to your competitors, probably the two most frequently asked questions, I think. And so it's very simple. It's just kind of what's the value of 1 second? And we write about this a lot, and there are a lot of case studies around this. I will go over a few of them. There's the one that we talked about earlier, where we just measured that the difference between, in this particular graph, the difference between page that loaded in roughly 2.5 seconds versus a page that loaded in 3.5 seconds was only about, I think, a couple, 0.2% in terms of conversion rate, 0.3%. It was not a significant sounding difference to somebody who doesn't understand metrics. So somebody who does understand metrics, they understand that 0.2, 0.4% difference in conversion actually kind of comes to roughly around 13 to 20% difference in conversions if you look at actually the total number of converted traffic. So if you think about the difference for in this particular graph, the difference between 2.5 seconds and 3.5 seconds is the difference between whether or not 20% of your conversions happen or not. That's a pretty big deal. And this is a really great graphic that just shows the impact of sort of what 1 second means across a bunch of different media sites. So again, it's just showing the benchmarks there.
And one call out about this that I'll make is that, again, back to that, how do I talk about two numbers to my business? One thing that Pat did, which I thought was great, was created this speed index. And speed index gave us a way to sort of start talking about performance with synthetic, while we could still have another conversation about the actual performance that we're measuring with RUM. So speed index is a great way to kind of look at how fast did that page visually render on my site, and how does that compare to my competitors, where you don't have to say, hey, we're 13 seconds and they're 16 seconds, and then the CEO comes in and says, well, you said we were 3.5 seconds. So speed index is a great way to kind of leverage that for that discussion.
Yeah, because you're never going to find one number. We talked about this earlier.
Yep.
There's just no one page speed number. So just a few case studies. Walmart, there was a great case study from a couple years ago.
It's a fantastic study.
It was a great case study. And they found that for every 1 second of improvement, they experienced roughly a 2% increase in conversions, which is pretty significant. And it looks very similar to this graph back here. Again, you see that it peaks really early and then it slides down pretty fast and kind of starts plateauing around 5 seconds, 6 seconds, and kind of flatlines around there.
Yeah, and that's an interesting mark too. I think that back when you were at Strangeloop, you guys sort of coined that frame, the performance poverty line, that after a certain point, it just kind of stops mattering, but really what you're focused on is that hockey stick there in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
This is 2% relative to
Yeah.
the baseline of the starting time value, right? So at 1 second, the rate is R, and at 1 second more, it's 1.02 R, or is it?
Yeah, so what you're saying is it a relative increase in conversion of 2% or is it a overall? And what this was relative. So if we're thinking about going from whatever it was 12% to 14%, it's that number is not the overall conversion rate number, which obviously that'd be pretty huge. Yeah.
So another one, I mean, you could think like, well, this is just that's Walmart, they're huge. Well, let's look like more of a mid-sized online business. So Auto Anything is an online auto parts reseller or retailer, and they cut their load times in half and experienced improvements across a bunch of metrics: conversion rate, cart size, sales. So a great case study from them as well. And then Staples, another great case study, where they shaved 1 second off their median load time and experienced a 10% increase in conversions.
And this was the same thing, just to answer your question, it was again relative, but 10% is pretty dang huge. Yeah, question.
Were these tests had control tests where they artificially changed the response time, or they all just...
She's looking at
question was there any control test done? And as much as we love to like go to people and say, hey, can you do this controlled test and make your site 10 seconds slower? It's funny, you really find out who believes in performance then when you ask that question, because it's like, are you crazy? But to be serious about your question, it's not controlled. Again, when we talk about it and we look at the all those different performance buckets and those cohorts, we're essentially doing that multivariate test and just isolating the response times for those different sessions and looking at that overall impact. But it wasn't. Although, I think Google and Bing did that study where they slowed things down arbitrarily, and they did have a control and saw, the impact on bounce rates and number of searches. And so, love those studies where people are brave enough to step out and do that. But I think what we quickly find is people don't want to put their traffic at risk and artificially slow something down.
We did a couple of those studies at Strangeloop, and where it just like a pretty small cohort, but still significant, when you consider the amount of traffic a big e-commerce site can get. And one customer had committed to doing it for 12 weeks, and then after about 3 weeks, they were looking at the data because they were really interested. It was coming in. We're like, we need to stop this test. This is a really bad idea. And so it just turned into a really good 3-week study as opposed to 12-week.
Question in the back.
Yeah, have you looked at how tricks like endless scrolling on like a content-oriented website, the text things, or like when you're scrolling down, it's preloading the next article, so you're not, people are actually.
So have we looked at? Yeah, so like on scroll type of rendering. Are you asking like have we looked at how we measure that, or have we looked at how that impacts? Yeah. I mean, well, to be honest, I think in the data we've looked at, we don't have the time to scroll metric that you're looking for to be able to do that analysis. I think it'd be interesting too. I can only think about it and say I would imagine it would have a big impact, but I don't have data to back it up. But it'd be an interesting case study to do for sure. And we've been talking about sort of time to scroll and how do we time that for a while. We've not rolled that out in our commercial product or in Boomerang yet because we don't want to impact people's sites in a negative way necessarily. But it'd be interesting. I think somebody should do that. I think it'd be an awesome study. So go for it. Do it and come and talk about it next year.
Question right there. Sorry.
I think Staples is censoring us right now. They asked us not to speak. Actually, so I think for this study that they did, this was on the desktop site, but I'm not positive. You can reference the slides from Velocity New York last year where they talked about it and see. All right, moving on.
Oh, so I mean, we just talked about some case studies, but what we find talking to people out in the world is that, well, so what? Those are those companies. They're not my company. My business is different. My people who come to my site, they're really loyal customers. They'll stay even if pages are slow, that sort of thing. So it's much more meaningful to people to ultimately look at their own data and to use their own data or proxies to simulate performance impact on their sites. So just as an example, this is sort of shows side-by-side comparison of two different retailers. The blue line is a specialty goods site, and the green line is general merchandise. And you see how the general merchandise site is much more affected by performance slowdowns than the specialty goods. So there is some argument for the fact that if you have a very niche product or a set of products and a niche sort of audience, they're a bit more of a captive audience, so they are willing to be somewhat more patient. But there is still, there is still some degradation in terms of bounce rate there. Yeah. And similarly, looking at conversions, you see the specialty goods site, that blue line. There's a bit of degradation. Maybe nothing to be alarmed about, although I think any line that goes down is a bad thing. But you see where the general merchandise retailer really, really suffers, starting with that 4.2 seconds and then just right down the slide.
And I think this makes sense intuitively. It's just nice to see the data backing it up. If I'm going to, Amazon and I'm buying, toilet paper. I'm not going to really be so intent on buying that toilet paper from Amazon necessarily. I can jump across somewhere else, or I can get off my couch and go to the grocery store and buy it, right? So I'm going to be much more influenced by performance in that situation versus if I'm on Lexus's site and I'm looking at this nice Lexus that I want to buy, I'm not going to say, oh, the site's slow, I'm going to hop off and buy a BMW instead. So it's intuitive, but it's also just illustrating that point that you really have to look at your own data.
Yep.
Two very extreme examples.
I was going to use the example of the Lego website. It's like, it doesn't matter how slow that thing is, my kid needs a kit, so I'm just there waiting. So also, not all pages are created equal. Like in an ideal world, sure, from a user experience perspective, it'd be great if every page of users flow through the site loaded in less than 100 milliseconds and people could just zip through and be done. But we see that there's a different impact at different ends of that conversion funnel. So at the top of the funnel, when people are browsing, you see conversion drops by up to 50%, basically when pages go from 1 to 6 seconds. So that's really significant. But you contrast that to the bottom of the funnel at checkout. Oh, okay. I got that little warning whine. And you see that there's much less impact to conversion on the checkout page. So people are committed, not so committed that some of them won't still bounce if pages get slow, because at the checkout, when pages start to slow down, some people kind of, they correlate that with like, oh, is there some kind of security glitch? Is it going to time out on me whenever I've given my, everybody hates that feeling of.
Is my credit card getting declined?
Exactly. Am I going to get billed twice if I have to do this again? Like, what's going on right now? So, there is some reason why, you do want to pay some attention to checkout, but just knowing that these rough differences exist helps you to prioritize, what metrics to look at for what pages.
And one of the things we look at to show that, and this is really sort of illustrating the same thing we saw in the other two examples, is creating this idea of a conversion impact score. This is something you can do with your own data. This isn't something proprietary or something that's out there, but what we're doing here is we're using a correlation, I think it's the Spearman correlation coefficient, to say how much impact did performance have on that metric? How much impact did performance have on checkout? And what we find consistently is, like we saw, browse pages like product pages, while they might actually be faster than a checkout page, our argument would be you actually need to make them faster than your checkout page because they have such a higher conversion impact. So this idea of conversion impact scoring, really understanding which pages make a difference, it might not be to start with the low-hanging fruit and start with this extremely slow checkout page. It might be optimize your search page a little bit more, shave another half a second off of your product page versus spending that time down funnel. So again, important to look at your own data. You can do this type of correlation analysis on your RUM data to identify where those hotspots really are.
So I'm really excited by this whole concept of having conversion impact scores and scoring your pages so that you can prioritize which ones to look at. We're going to be writing a blog post about it on our blog, so you can watch for that sometime in the next little while.
Yeah.
So how do you get there? So I think, how much time do we have left? Okay, we've got like 15 minutes. I think we're okay.
Yeah, I think we're actually doing just about right.
All right.
Yeah, so we got about 15 minutes.
I mean, really, how do you get there? How do you make your pages as fast as you need them to be, as fast as your metrics are telling you there? Well, that's what this whole conference is about, so we're not going to try to stuff all that into the next 10 or 15 minutes. But I think the first idea is you start with creating a performance budget. And so you have something.
I think you had some references to that.
So this idea that you look at your metrics and you correlate, well, if we need our pages to be this fast and pages that are this fast on our site generally correlate to a certain size, say under 1 meg, then you set performance budget for those pages. So I could write a blog post about this topic, but Tim Cadlick already wrote all the good ones, so I'm just going to send you to his site. So I really encourage you to read Setting a Performance Budget and Performance Budget Metrics. Really, really good posts, both of them.
Yeah, and I think, how do I get there? Using all these tools, pulling out examples. We gave an example about Zosta's site that was relaunched today and how excited we were when it was so much faster. A lot of that work comes in the fact that you're visually comparing and saying, okay, we're going to set a budget and reduce our number of third-party scripts by X and hold to that budget. And every time we deploy, we're going to make sure that we don't pass through that. I think performance has been historically something that always gets moved to the end, always gets thought about last. We never really enforce a lot of those criteria. So you'll hear a lot about performance budgets this week. I think there's one thing you could really take back to your organization in terms of having an impact and making a difference. It would be centered around that discussion. Mm-hmm. Maybe not one thing, but that's a very important thing.
Yeah. So. Top 5, at
least.
Yep,
for sure.
You also want to set SLAs, service level agreements, on your pages that are very meaningful and specific to that page.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let you go.
Yeah, and you're going to have mixed success with this. In a past life, I did a lot of this because I was very focused on third-party performance. And what we would see is that, a lot of times the third parties, and I'm a third party too, but the third parties were not willing to support an SLA or really, so they define something very vague. Here's an example of actually a good SLA to think about how you might measure that using RUM. So response time measured using resource timing from a Chrome browser in the United States is not to exceed a median or 50th percentile of 100 milliseconds or 95th percentile of 500 milliseconds or a population of more than 500 users in a 24-hour period. It's a mouthful, right? But you've taken the time to actually go out, look, and segment, and think about how are we specifically going to measure this performance. And I find that a lot of times the contention from third parties is not the fact that they don't want to support an SLA. It's just that they're kind of hard to back up, and you can challenge them with synthetic data that's maybe different from your RUM data. So we encourage people to use RUM to set those SLAs and work more with their third-party providers versus this, which is kind of a bad SLA, right? Very generic, but I've seen them like this, right? So, okay, we'll give you an SLA. We'll make a best effort to ensure the average response time is within reasonable limits. Something very vague and undefined. So a great way for you to go about it. Yeah?
Cliff, on the SLAs, are you using synthetic markers on the previous example to define the bounds of the SLA is within what, or are you using standard things around page load? Or
yeah, what I would encourage people to do, and I think using synthetic is a great way to look at page complexity and the impact third parties have. But I think for enforcing an SLA, what I would encourage people to do is to look at using RUM for that and using resource timing. So that's not setting markers in the page. It's actually just pulling back using some of those examples we gave earlier about resource timing to pull that data. It's supported in
a bunch of different markers, a bunch of different measurements of resources.
Yeah.
So wouldn't you want to specify that here?
I think you may, if it's for a specific asset, so it's more, I'm talking about response time, so it was like response time duration. You could get more specific, but then that would require that the vendor was supporting the, timing allow origin headers, which is a whole nother topic. So I think this is still pretty specific, but obviously you could go more specific than that. But this is something that I've seen that works and is manageable. And from my perspective, it's a huge step in the right direction in terms of, holding people accountable, but also having a single source of truth that both vendor and client can get behind. So I hope that answers the question. We can chat more about it if you want, and some things that we've done that worked and didn't work, again, in a past life. So.
May I ask a related follow-up? So you haven't mentioned exposure control.
Okay.
That is, deploying initially to a small cohort or canary, and then going broad.
So
do you have any data on that as on how much better that makes people or not?
So the question was, or the comment was that we haven't really commented on deploying like a smaller batch, like more of like a canary build or something like that into the wild, and seeing how that performed and how that related. You're right, we didn't mention it in the talk, but I think it's a great practice. I think that that's one way of kind of isolating, and people do this all the time with A/B testing, where they're testing different treatments to a page or something like that, which could be done for performance as well. But I think what we find in practice most times when people make it faster, they're like, yeah, let's make it faster. Let's just push out the whole build, right? But I don't know, it's an interesting topic, and I think in terms of exposure control, I don't know, I'm sure there's a lot of talks around that, around continuous development and deployment that would maybe go into a bit more detail on it. But this is, we didn't really have the focus on that. We could chat more about it. If anybody's got feedback or their own experience, I'd encourage them to maybe come up to the front and talk a bit about more after the talk's over. So.
Question right here.
Yeah.
Where would you begin to define an SLA for a market, a non-US market, that you really don't have any information on what would be considered fast? For example, like Brazil mobile users.
Yeah.
That doesn't actually correlate with US.
So the question was, where would you begin to define an SLA for a market that's outside of like your current market? So example was mobile devices in Brazil. I think that's the great thing about rum. You sprinkle that red dye in the water and then it's everywhere. So I think what I would be looking at is comparative. Like, okay, well, we've got a comparative third party. We want to see how it performs in the U.S. and that's where we're, and I'm not meaning to be, thinking about just the U.S. or whatever, but for the example of a U.S. site, we might only care about the SLA in the U.S., but you might start to isolate that and just say, how does that compare, and what's the demographic? Because you might see a lot more mobile use in another country versus what you see in the U.S. So I would use RUM, I would isolate, and just compare multidimensionally across those different geographies. Yeah, in the back? Uh-huh. So I heard part of that, I think, let me see if I got it right. You said somewhat related. China has other issues besides performance. They're just getting blocked in general and content being blocked. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there's a couple of comments there that I would think would be relevant to the talk. One is making sure you're protected against the SPOF. So if it is blocked, make sure it doesn't kill the rest of your page, right? In terms of measuring an SLA, you can't really measure an SLA for something that you can't really measure the performance of. So it's pretty hard to do that in that case. So I'd question the relevancy of an SLA for something in China if that wasn't the market you were serving. And thirdly, I would say that synthetic is maybe a better way to go about measuring that, because you could test that out. You could actually have nodes that were in China and identify those blockings versus resource timing, where you're just not going to see the asset show up because it'll time out or whatever, and it won't be exposed to the resource timing tree. So hopefully that's enough of a kind of shotgun answer, but not it. Okay,
right.
One more question, and then we'll move on to the slides and close.
All web pages are different. How do you have a way of different SLAs for different kind of web pages?
Yeah, you look at your own data, right? So I think the question was, all web pages are different. Do you have different SLAs for different web pages? I think you go about setting performance budgets and SLAs based on the impact to your users and your KPIs. So again, back to that point of you have to look at your own data, because you're absolutely right. Web pages are different, right? And conversion impact score is going to be different from one site to the next. Your content may be more engaging on one site than another site, or if you're a specialty goods retailer versus a more commodity goods retailer. So it's going to be different, and that's the importance of looking at your own data and referring back to kind of what we talked about there, where you have to look at your own data, base those SLAs based on what you're targeting in terms of your conversion and your overall business goals as a way for you personally to actually set those goals versus sticking your finger in the air or going off of a Walmart or Amazon study that really has nothing to do with your own site. So good reinforcement of that topic. So I think.
So I just wanted to point out this slide. This is actually from a talk that Steve did about real user monitoring versus synthetic. And I really like this depiction of how Etsy surfaces their SLA right on the pages for it. So basically in-house, they see this on their live site where just across the top you see like how the page renders, and you can see that the page violates their SLA for the back end performance. So it's there. It's super visible, and it's all done just with beaconing. And actually, another shout out, kind of in the Etsy area, is you should just this idea that you really don't want to be a one-person operation or just like your tiny siloed performance team within your organization. You really, performance should be an organizational conversation. It touches a lot of people, as we talked about. The metrics affect everybody, and everybody has metrics that they care about. Lara Hogan wrote a really great book called Designing for Performance, which I really recommend for everyone. Chapter 8, where she talks about how to create or change the performance culture at your organization, is really, really excellent and kind of relevant to this conversation. So just shout out for that. And if you're looking for more on this topic, our blog is performancebeacon.com, not performancebacon.com, although we are thinking about buying that as well. So you can find us there online. Thank you.